Hello and welcome back to Parlay. This prompt was written by True Parley Grandmaster Foot. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about why games won't show us the numbers. June Parlay. I have started playing Lies of P recently. So far it's very much unlike Elden Ring, because it actually has some new ideas and knows how to properly balance a game. Oof, heavy damage. This is not a parlay about the mediocrity of Elden Ring, and this is not about Lies of P. This is a parlay about a personal frustration that both of these games have in common. They both refuse to give you any damn numbers of any of their fucking items. Increases attack damage against staggered foes? The fuck does that mean? This description includes a 0.1% damage increase and a 100 times damage multiplier. How am I supposed to evaluate the opportunity cost of my options? Yes, we could discuss the whole if they don't tell you it doesn't matter, but it does. Or my favorite response, numbers scare off players. If that's the case, don't display on-hit damage numbers. But no, I don't want to be angry. I just want to be happy. What do we do about this? I feel frustrated not knowing. Telling me not to worry about it hurts my build-making brain. Looking it up on a wiki is breaking my train of thought and my sense of immersion. I don't have time to mod the game. This is my parlay question. Is there a good way to deal with this annoyance? Yeah. I can help with that. Yeah, I hate this too, as you know from many streams. I will thesis right away that I do not think there is an actual good reason why games don't include these things, and we will talk in great detail about like what some reasons could be and why it is good to include them. But I don't think there's a good reason they're not included, really. We can't know for sure, but I'm fairly confident saying I'm going to die on the hill of there isn't a good reason not to include the numbers, if that vindicates you. And I'm not sure there's a lot you can do about it, because I think that part of the fun of a lot of these games, for you, for me, for people who are enjoying making builds in them, is thinking about the options. And therefore, if the game doesn't include information about them, things working okay is only part of the solution. If the game is really well balanced, but doesn't tell you, all the parameters or whatever, that doesn't remove this problem, because part of the fun was thinking about the parameters you knew. And so, while some players might not have a problem with it, sure, it isn't not a problem. I just thought I would vindicate you for a minute, because you seem rather cross about this, and I am also cross about this subject, so I don't know what we need to do there. Did that get into the mic? Yeah, you can sort of hear them. The chest thump. Yeah, they're all right. Yeah, sort of. That'll have to do. But unfortunately, now, to try to find some meaningful answer, we need to sink our fingers, our fingies, into the muck, the ooze of reasoning that people give why it's good, actually, for the damage numbers not to be in the game, even though there isn't any good reason. As far as I could tell anyway. We are going to talk about some of them. I'm going to then break down, well, what do we do now? And we'll see if we get anywhere more practical. I do have like a thought here and there. But overall, I don't think I have a good way to like feel better about this. Hopefully it will just make you less frustrated hearing someone talk about it. So 2 sections basically for this parlay. The first one is why don't they give you the friggin' numbers? And then, well, they don't usually. So what do we do? Starting with the why don't they give you the numbers section. So we are going to talk a little bit about some of the reasoning you brought up. I personally agree with you that it doesn't make any sense. So I'm just going to say why I don't think it makes any sense, and then we'll move on to a few other reasons, and then talk about it a bit. So the first one you brought up is we could discuss the whole if they don't tell you it doesn't matter, and then you said it does. Well, yeah, I mean, so the if they don't tell you it doesn't matter thing, the idea is that the game might not be telling you its numerical values for effects, because you're meant to get to have the theoretically pleasant experience of just assuming that those numerical values for effects are good. And you can just pick them, safe in the knowledge that, like, it's a good amount, you don't need to worry about it. And in theory, I don't think this is the least noble goal. For example, in a game where I can bounce my I'm playing a game called Against Great Darkness recently, where you bounce these discs, kind of like Pong or a brick break game, but it's also kind of a scroller shooter. And in effect, will say you do more damage every time a disc bounces or whatever. Every time you bounce a disc damage increases. Now, this game actually does tell you how much, but you could imagine a game where they don't tell you, and they don't tell you because you're meant to assume, oh, it's like by a good amount, And then if you take it, you hopefully notice that the disc damage is higher when you bounce the disc a lot of times, and then you're good and it's fine. And I think a lot of developers are thinking, possibly good-naturedly, oh, well, the number thing gets in the way of the player making interesting decisions if they feel like they have to calculate whether that is a good amount. Why would we put this effect in the game if it wasn't a good amount of damage? It just is a good amount of damage. So the player can, just go be free, right? And there are two problems. The first one is that for a lot of players, as we've already established, the fun is breaking down whether or not that is what they'd consider a good amount of the effect. It might depend on the situation, whether it's a good amount of the effect. Maybe if you have 20 discs on the field, then increasing your disc damage by a little bit is really good, but it's not that good otherwise, and so you want to know by how much. That could be interesting in and of itself. Just like some players might be scared off if they feel like they have to manage that, other players will be scared off or, put off if they can't figure that stuff out. Maybe obviously. But it's a trade-off, of course, and I bet many developers don't see it that way, don't think it's a trade-off. They think it's just ideal for you to not have to worry about the number thing. People are very quick, very lazy to assume that the thing they don't like is something no one likes, when in fact, nearly everybody likes some things, everything. And so the question is, how many people like each thing? Is it a significant number? It probably is. Watching any amount of YouTube or video game coverage would tell you that lots of people enjoy the numbers thing. And then you just have to decide if you want to cater to this audience or that one. It's a trade-off, sure, but there's not really any question that it's like wrong to not include the numbers or right to include the numbers. It's clearly just the subjective choice that would appeal to one party or another. I think my problem then is that many games that don't include these numbers are about making informed decisions, but you can't actually do that if you don't have the numbers. Either that or every single upgrade in the entire game is good at all times, and therefore it actually doesn't matter which things you pick. I think that's the flaw. Problem number 2 is that you cannot trust the game designers to make things balanced in an interesting way. No, you can't. Some of you are thinking, but games are reasonably balanced, but they're like not though. If you've dug into a lot of games' build systems, I think you will have experienced that shockingly few games are that close to being well balanced. And thus, this is a little unfair to a lot of game developers. But the other reason that them not telling you isn't good enough is because I have it on good authority that you didn't balance it that well, game developers. I don't have good reason to trust you that it's well balanced, and therefore I don't trust you, and I would rather look for myself. And in many games, I can have some fun with the somewhat good balance that you achieved, but not if I don't see for myself. And so there is a two-pronged, a wealth really of reasons why the game not telling you isn't a good reason for the game to not tell you, like, because they don't want you to focus there. Like, we're just not there yet, in my opinion. I also have a suggestion, game developers. If you're thinking, well, I am going to be the one who makes good game balance, and I don't want to show players, and I don't want some nerd like you to complain that you don't get to see the numbers because you don't actually like this. You just want to jerk off to your knowledge of the game. I could spend my time refuting that claim and saying that I think it's intellectually stimulating and healthy, and in the name of being wrong and getting excited about your ideas being usurped, to think about the numbers, not a way to masturbate my knowledge about a video game. But instead I'll say this, just make it a toggle. Make it so the players can choose if they want those details in the game, and make it default to you'll have to make a call about what type of audience you want. Some players will come into the game, not know they can toggle the details on or off, and get pushed away from the game. But a good amount of players will be held on to. They'll look into the options menu for a way to get the detail or turn it off or something, and they'll find that. The more games do this, the better it goes. And so I personally feel like there is a solution here. And there really isn't an excuse to not put the information in the game. There just might be a good reason to not always show the player the information, but making it not findable in the game, I do not accept that there is any good reason to not to do that. Another way to put this is, what if a wiki for the game could be in the game? Is there a good reason not to do that in some games? My answer is no, not really. Unless the entire point of the game is to not know what's going on. I just don't think there's a good reason for that. You're getting bonuses in this parlay. I'm even going to suggest ways you can do things better and not just stamp my foot and say put the damn numbers in the games, even though that's what I think, to be honest. I'm open to different solutions. Let's move on to that one, actually. Your favorite response, Parley Grandmaster Foot. Numbers scare off players. If that's the case, don't display on hit damage numbers. Now, this has always been a weird claim, but if you've been a person who's complained about this in your life, or been around the internet a few times, you'll have heard people say it's because they don't want to overwhelm the player with a bunch of numbers or whatever. Now, a couple of things. I do think it is a valid, real thing that people see like a bunch of numerical data in their game and get intimidated, even though it's not complicated to figure out and is really just there as a reference so you can see if you want to be able to see. I do think that's a real thing, and it is okay for people who feel that way to enjoy video games. It's just like how measuring out your coffee or tea or, I don't know, cocktail ingredients is extremely easy and not complicated or time-consuming at all, and makes your thing in the morning taste better or whatever. But there are valid, in a way, reasons to not want to do that. The aesthetic of having to measure it might seem involved in the morning. It's not to be blunt, but like it isn't. Just be an adult and hit one button to turn on a scale. That isn't complicated. That's not magically complicated for some people and not others. It isn't complicated, it just isn't. But the aesthetic is complicated feeling to some people, technical in a way they don't live some other parts of their life. And it is okay if people don't like that. That's fine, I guess. By the same token, the idea that you would follow a cooking recipe to a T but wouldn't measure out your coffee in the morning isn't as much of a contradiction as it seems. You are familiar with eyeballing the amount of coffee that is fine for you, and while you might like it better if you did it differently, yeah, sure, I mean, you're the sovereign of whether you think that coffee tastes fine, while you maybe are not familiar with the recipe, and so you'll follow the numbers on the recipe, even though you normally would shy away from the mere aesthetic of carefully following a recipe. I don't think that this is as contradictory or ridiculous as it sounds, though I do think it's ultimately not in the name of people having the best experience they could. I do think if you could just psychically force people to measure their stupid coffee beans, they would be strictly better off, and there's really no reason there isn't actually a reason not to do that. But is there like coherent reasoning why people don't? Sure. I just think ultimately they would benefit more if they did. And I could be wrong about that too. Likewise, seeing the numbers when you're building your character, and then that maybe scares you off or whatever, but then seeing on-hit damage numbers doesn't, is reasonable, in my opinion. The damage numbers are performative. We had a really interesting discussion one time on a stream about Warframe, I think, where Mr. Food, it might have even been you actually, you recommended turning off damage numbers in Warframe, and that got us into a discussion, because to me it didn't make much of a difference, about like what they do. What are the numbers for? It's visual feedback. You get some kind of thermometer of a sort of how much damage is coming in the game you're playing. When you get big crits, you see the big crits, and then you know your effect went off. That kind of thing. I'm reminded of the Smedikavat, which gives random buffs to the player while it's on the field in Warframe. And as a companion, you could say the Smedikavat is kind of unfulfilling because a lot of the buffs it gives you, you might not notice. Now and again, you'll get double loot, but you don't really experience that in gameplay that readily, at least not always. One of the buffs gives you guaranteed double crits, like 200% crit chance, and you see that when it triggers. I think that that is meaningful. Seeing how much damage you're doing doesn't particularly do anything. I mean, it's going to be about 3 times what you did before, whatever. The more meaningful part is that you know that your effect went off. Therefore, I think it is not that much of a contradiction to think players don't, want to see the involved numbers in the build screen, and yet do want to see the in-game damage numbers. I don't think that that's like an invalid feeling. The reason that I agree with you, Mr. Foot, that this one gets a massive eye roll for me is that it was really more on the developer side. Point the first. I don't think that developers actually think this that often. I think players assume this much more than it's true. And a topic I'm going to get into going into the second half of the video is the idea that as people are reasoning through a subject, we are going to find it very unsatisfying to claim that something has no real reason to be the way it is, no well thought through reason, good or bad at the end of the day, really no reason to be the way it is, but that probably is the explanation here. The explanation is probably that they made no real decision about what to communicate to the player. Not that they made a decision and it's a bad decision, or they made a decision and it's a good decision. That the explanation is probably that they made no real decision, no decision of substance. They just put on the information that occurred to them first when they thought of it, and that's it. They didn't do real work to balance that out. I think many games did and just made a bad set of decisions, or an only kind of good, not that good set of decisions. But I do think the answer is ultimately for this section is going to be they didn't really make a decision about the subject. That being said, I think a lot of players tend to do this weird thing where they assume they know better because they are giving the developer a lot of credit. They think, oh, well, it's a game developer, the big professional game developer. How could they be allowed to just do things wrong? This is the same logic people use when they say that if a lot of society is doing a thing, like marriage or a normal career track, that it makes sense to do. How could all those people possibly be wrong? But they could and they are, because they're using the same logic. They're not using any logic to determine whether a thing is a good idea, other than that a lot of people are doing it. And if nobody checks their work, they absolutely can all be wrong about that. And I think that that's the case. I think that a lot of game developers are, for all of their noble effort, they make games, which is more than many of us can say. They are not very experienced at thinking about game design, not making games as a whole, not the general topic we refer to as game design, but designing game systems, that specific subject, basically doing philosophy or psychology about what a game system would do to players. This is not something that most people making games or humans in general have a lot of experience with. And so I think that the layperson, to some extent, rightly assumes that the game developer is more of a professional than they are, but in the wrong way, in a way that the game developer really isn't a professional at, which is player psychology, I guess. And we'll get into that more in the next section as well, because it has to do with, I think, the root of the problem, which has to do with playtesting. This problem is secretly a giant Ouroboros of sadness. Thus, I think that players are more arguing. The numbers scare off other players. And while that isn't actually that much of a contradiction, and I'm sure it actually does happen, in my opinion, I think that players are not arguing accurately from the position of developers. Developers, on the other hand, probably aren't thinking, oh, well, don't show the players any damage numbers because that's going to scare people off. I bet some are. And I wouldn't be surprised if those games don't display on-hit damage numbers or offer an option to hide them, even though that may be misguided. That seems more consistent, and so maybe they'll do that. From a player's perspective, numbers scaring off players isn't a coherent argument because the game does show the player a lot of numbers, but from a developer's perspective, they might follow through, and there are probably plenty of games we just haven't noticed don't show you numbers they could in the build system, and don't show you damage numbers, or show you both of those things. I probably just wouldn't have noticed that because I don't think that this is part of the issue. However, point the second, I also think it's the case that a lot of games that do assume it's not good to show the player all this data are lacking a sort of confidence And this is a complicated part of the issue because I'm not sure I or anyone knows whether a lot of people like making builds. If you make a choice to cater your game toward an audience of people who like having that information or not, I'm not sure it is knowable what the size of that audience is or what they like. That is part of why I'm doing this for a living, to try to determine those things so that developers that are paying attention can actually decide about that subject. And so I do think it's the case that a lot of developers hedge their bets about that stuff. They say, oh, players who are really into this will look it up on the wiki. It's not a big deal. It's better to prioritize the other player. And I wonder if they would feel different if they knew more about those players that want the information. If they knew more about them, if they were a more known quantity, would they decide differently in their games about this subject? I think the best answer I can give for why a lot of developers don't put the information in is copying what's been done before or hedging their bets, assuming that there are players they know about that don't want that information, and therefore it might be better to just not worry as much about the players that do. After all, they can go get that information themselves. In fact, this same format of argument is really common on the internet in general. Players will say things like, well, if you don't like this part of this game that you're arguing ruins the flow of the game and should just be taken out for everyone, but I do like this flow of this game, you should just not use it. You can just not use it, so you're wrong for complaining about it. But this is ridiculous. It's a good idea to complain about that aspect of the game if it clashes with the game's design goals, period. It doesn't matter who can or can't choose not to do it. What matters is who the game is trying to be for and whether it fulfills that goal. Baldur's Gate 3 and camp casting is my favorite example. In Baldur's Gate 3, there's a thing you can do where you can use your unfulfilled or unrecruited, or they're not going with you on the day's adventure, party members, to cast spells like passive buffs on you and your party and give you healing items and such. A bunch of stuff, actually. And then you can remove them from your party, keep those effects, and go about your day with a significant advantage in combat. It is very tedious and annoying to do. It's a bad user experience to do. Very bad. To the point that I think it's pretty clear that the developers aren't like trying to make that a fun part of the game. Now, a lot of players say they like it or don't, and the argument devolves because the players who like it say, why don't you just not use it? That's beside the point. I mean, if you're trying to use every advantage, and that's meant to be the fun part of the game, needing to pretend that you can't campcast is something that affects players' fun. Just not doing it isn't just not doing it. That has consequences. But none of this actually matters. The question is, does it further Baldur's Gate 3's game design goals to include that in the game? And then we can say, well, we're going to include it or not because the game is trying to be for this or that kind of player more. The players are not the ones to say, my personal taste determines the game design goals of this game. Obviously, that doesn't matter at all. You may be the target audience for this game design or not. Your enjoyment of the game has nothing to do with that. You might enjoy it despite the game not trying to cater to your design tastes. And your enjoyment, despite the game not catering to your design tastes, does not mean you are suddenly in charge of what does and doesn't belong in the game. The game's design goal is what is in charge of what does and doesn't belong in the game. Obviously, if players would enjoy having Animal Crossing in Genshin Impact, I mean, that type of player can have it in the game, sure. But are other players wrong for saying, well, I don't want to feel FOMO because I don't want to play Animal Crossing and Genshin Impact to get, an extra day of the week's worth of rewards? Well, whether or not that should be in the game has to do with who Genshin Impact is targeting. And I think because Genshin Impact is targeting a wide audience, it is in line with the game's design philosophy to include that element, even though a huge number of players who will have liked the game up to that point won't like that, and it will seem like the game is doing wrong to the players that like it. We don't see the large number of players who want that in the game. Or it's possible that it is just a mistake. The game developer isn't accurately tracing the game's design goals, or doesn't even have proper design goals for the game written down, and thus is making ultimately a mistake, but only in terms of utility. Some people will still really like it, a lot of people. a seeming vocal majority because people don't properly understand their own biases. But in fact, the totality of humanity will like this less than if they'd done it a different way. We can't know that. No one can know that. Not even their survey data can tell them that, because we don't know who is and isn't filling out the survey, motivated by what external factors. So it's a guess, but I personally think that a lot of games are hedging their bets on not showing you the information, because that's often how it's done. It might be less work, and because they don't have that clear design goals. They don't have it in mind how you make a game fun for people who like making builds. And that's not entirely their fault, in that basically nobody currently knows that. I mean, I'm trying to make a scholarship out of it, but I'm trying to do a science about it, but I mean, I don't know. That would be my response. There are other more insidious ways, you could say. I'm trying to decide whether to include this bit, but let's do it. There are other insidious ways that a developer might choose not to show the numbers. The game might be poorly balanced, but most players won't notice if you don't show them the numbers they're thinking. Now, I think the players who really care about your game will notice, and so I'm not sure that really accomplishes much, because the vocal minority will become people who've figured it out. It's really common for players to critique or praise a game for like a behind the scenes piece of information nowadays. The vocal minority will become people who sidestep you not showing them the numbers. And so there's not like really a point to trying to deceive people into thinking it's better balanced. But I don't know. I mean, maybe those games sell better, and then there's a sad but I guess fair argument that it has some benefit. I don't know. And I also think there's this thing about players kind of psyching themselves out. Like, you can just think through logically what pieces would work well together, but some players will be distracted if there are numerical values associated with it. An example of this would be something like, let's say that you think about separate multipliers. So you think it makes sense that if something gives you more damage per bullet and another thing gives you more bullets per pull of the trigger, it's intuitive that those would multiply each other's benefits, and thus you think it would be good to put them both on at once. But then if the game shows you the number, the amount of those things that you get, the player may psych themselves out and second guess that logic and go, oh, well, but the number doesn't, to me, accurately communicate that they are separate multipliers, so maybe they're not. And maybe it's less clear in a way. I personally think this is a communication problem. I think it's easy to say, yeah, you can't word things in a way where every player will understand how it's supposed to work. But I feel like you can if you try really hard, actually. Yes. There are games where I think some players might understand the game better if you change nothing except remove the numbers. But simultaneously, you could just write the numbers in a clearer way where the same players would also understand it if you gave them the numbers, but just better. You see what I mean? So I don't think saying that giving the players the numbers confuses them out of a good build decision they were going to make is a good argument. That just means the game's writing isn't as good as it could be. And while that's not always easy to fix, it is certainly fixable. And if the game is going to be about that, I mean, that's the job. That's what you have to do. All right, I think we've done enough beating the horse to death about why those are not good reasons to not show the player the damage numbers. If you want the game to be about that, there you go. Now, this does lead us to a kind of interlude question, which is, if you are frustrated that a game doesn't give you the damage numbers, I do think that it is good scholarship to look at the game and say, is this game trying to be about making builds? But in my experience, a lot of the games that we've discussed frustration about this, Mr. Food, are trying to be about making build decisions in some form. And so I don't personally think it's good reasoning. Certainly Lies of P and Elden Ring to some extent, I would say there isn't a great argument that the game shouldn't be giving you those numbers, or at the very least that the game's design goal about what the build experience is meant to be like is confused. I don't think that the damage output of different weapon combinations in Lies of P is very clear, and it's really something you feel out and experience, and they make it easy to test that out and feel it out. You get a target dummy in the hotel lobby area. But when you go to your stats screen, there's a lot of weird math going on under the hood in the Lies of P stats screen that doesn't really square with the idea that you're supposed to like not know or not think about the numbers. You both do know because they tell you, and will have trouble thinking about because there's a bunch of weird math behind the scenes to kind of average things out, the numbers in the game's, stat system. And so I think it's fair to say that when you ask, is this a game where it would make sense to be given the numbers? The answer is the developers are not adequately clear on that subject. And I think, unfortunately, that is the answer for most games, which is what defeats this as a solution. You could go to a game and alleviate your frustration in some cases by noticing that I'm sure there are games where I and Mr. Foot have been frustrated to not be given the numbers that upon further inspection, it probably doesn't serve the game's design goals to be given the numbers, and that's just the kind of fun that I would like to have with the game. Now, I am tempted to bring up my point from before that it's not like you can't have your cake and eat it too here. It really doesn't do much to harm these games if you give the player an option menu setting to just say what the stuff in the game does. And it does kind of speak to a concern about why the game is like that if the game desperately wants to not tell you those numbers. And so while it might be more extra work, I think a lot of players want those details. Why not include them? Why not default to not showing the player the numbers, but put in an options menu toggle that lets you see them? Okay, but yeah, there are some games where, sure, maybe I would be frustrated, Mr. Foot would be frustrated not seeing the damage numbers, but there isn't really a good argument for the damage numbers to be there. It doesn't serve the game's design goals. Sometimes. But I think most of the time, your experience will be that upon reflection, it is hard to say whether it serves the game's design goals, because the game's design vision for what making a build is about, why do you make decisions in this game? What experience of making decisions that are meaningful for your playstyle, to have a different gameplay experience, does the game have for you? What is the game's vision for what those decision-making processes will be like? I think you will find, to your frustration, that most of the time the answer is that is not entirely clear when taking the game as a whole. The game isn't very clear with itself about what that's supposed to look like. And thus, you can't use this as a way to feel much better most of the time. Game design, when tackling making a build system, is simply not very good at this moment in human history, in my opinion. And I'm here to therapy you through that period of time until we somehow make it better. Does that make you feel any better? I thought not. Let's move on to section 2, which will be shorter because we've covered a lot of ground. Now, to remind you, Mr. Foot said, I don't want to be angry. I just want to be happy. What do we do about this? I feel frustrated not knowing the numbers and what to do about it. Telling me not to worry about it hurts my build-making brain. We talked about how that really isn't a reasonable response. Looking it up on a wiki is breaking my train of thought and my sense of immersion, and also just like, if it fits the game's design idea, it just should be in the game. I don't have time to mod the game. Please nobody in the comments say, oh, it actually doesn't take 2 seconds to mod the game. Like, listen, but we're talking about whether it would be good for it to be in the core game. The modding thing is irrelevant. Mr. Foot isn't wrong for being frustrated because they don't want to mod the game. It's fine. You don't have to mod the game. You shouldn't need to mod the game. That's fine. Is there a good way to deal with this annoyance? In section 2, I will say no, but a lot of times. I mean, you can play through the game just hoping that things will be kind of well balanced. A lot of people have been shouting this whole time, no, Zandy, when you covered the if they don't tell you it doesn't matter thing, we want to ask you, well, did you try a variety of builds and did they feel okay? Why do you need to know the numbers? And to be fair, there are games where, yeah, I mean, you might be able to still have some fun getting a feel for the game by just seeing if the builds feel relatively balanced, just off the top of your head. Now, there are various flaws here. If you do your best to just make like the average or obvious build in a game with a lot of options, I mean, you might just not make the one that does work fairly well intuitively. There are lots of options in these games, and so it's not often obvious to just double check, if you throw all the good goblin cards in a pile, are goblins viable in Modern, in Magic? What do you mean all of the good goblin cards? There's like 500 of those. Like, which ones are you putting in the deck? You know what I mean? And lots of players that are way less experienced at having this type of discussion say, oh no, the good ones though, right? Well, let me ask you something. Does that include Goblin Grenade? Does that include Goblin Chieftain, Goblin War Chief, Rundvelt Horde Master, or whatever that card's called? The 1/1 for 2 mana that gives goblins +1/+1, and then when it dies or a goblin dies, you like look at the top card of your library, and if it's a goblin, you put it into play. Does that count? Does Warren Instigator count? Which are the good goblins? Nerd, like that's not knowable anyway. And so while you can kind of vibe check, do builds feel relatively balanced in this game? You can only do that to a point. No one knows all builds. No one can try all builds, obviously. And so while you can do your best to make what would seem like a reasonable build for, I don't know, maybe there are 5 classes in this game, and you make what seems like the most obvious way to play each one, and then you see if they felt like they were at similar power levels to you. Yeah, you can do that, but the odds that you simply missed a reasonably obvious but just different obvious way to play those characters, and that actually is pretty well balanced, but you just missed that one, is pretty high. Like, that's just the nature of these games. The whole goal of an interesting build system is arguably to make it so good options are not too obvious. Not obscure, but not like blatantly obvious. It's clearly better to use this than everything else. And so to the degree that a build system is likely to be any good, you will have trouble like just feeling it out if the build system is going to feel great, right? So that kind of doesn't work. I mean, you can use fun as your god and say, if I am having fun, I am willing to just say, it's fine, there are interesting options. The fact that you can go to the heart of the universe and conclude that the game is not well balanced doesn't ruin my fun. Yeah, it might not. That certainly isn't a defense of the game's design. But, I mean, it's possible it won't. Of course, the fly in the ointment is that part of the fun is making decisions where you know what the thing in the game does. And so even if the builds feel okay to use in practice, if the game doesn't show you the numbers, part of the way you can have fun making builds is simply not possible because you need to see, merely seeing the numbers is part of the fun. When I look at a new set in Magic, a lot of the fun sometimes is to see they let you do what for what mana cost? Like just that, and then thinking through, like, is this balanced? What are we doing here? Is interesting. There's a card recently that came out that's like, it's 3 mana, it's a white spell. You put back onto the battlefield 2 creatures from your graveyard that cost 2 or less mana. And then you can give your opponent a card, you can have your opponent draw a card, and if you do, you put a third 2 mana or less creature from your graveyard back onto the battlefield. For 3 mana, you can put 3 2 mana or less creatures from your graveyard back into play. Your opponent draws a card. Or you can just do 2 and your opponent doesn't get to draw. It's very mana efficient if you have the targets, but if you take 3 creatures, then you draw them a card deeper, and then maybe they'll have a board wipe, and then they kill all your stuff. And if it's only 2 creatures, it's not that mana efficient, and it doesn't do anything unless you have those 2 creatures in your graveyard, and they have to be ones you'd want to play, rather than drawing a new card that just like is a creature you want to play. It's kind of interesting to me how that card is balanced. I haven't played it, I might not play it, but it's just kind of interesting to mull over, like, this is what it does. Obviously in Magic this wouldn't work, but if the card were to say something like, a bunch of small stuff comes back from your graveyard, it's good, like, shut up. You know what I mean? I would go, like, how small? What stuff? How does it work? Of course, right? Because the game isn't built around not telling you, like, the numbers. That's just insane in Magic. It wouldn't make sense. But there are plenty of games that do that. I hope that example illustrates how part of the fun can be just thinking through, do I want this mechanic in my deck? What am I choosing to put in if I choose to do it? What are the odds that it's going to be good? I don't know, thinking about stuff like that. It can be fun. If you play Magic or similar games, you've also probably had the fun of simply building a deck, just building a deck, which is fun in that game because you can follow through the logic of how the deck would work without playing it. And you can do that because they show you the numbers, obviously. It's interesting to think about a build or a strategy in some games that give you adequate numbers to hold on to. It doesn't even have to be numbers, just you know what the effects do. Because you know what they do, you're clear about how it would turn out. Needing to wait and see could be its own kind of fun, but it is certainly a type of fun you can have to theorycraft. Surely nobody is going to argue that it like isn't possibly fun to theorycraft. Like, you might not enjoy it, but clearly some people just do enjoy it. They're not like faking enjoying it. That is a type of fun. And if the game doesn't tell you the numbers, you cannot have that type of fun with the game. You might be able to mod it in. It's possible that modding it in won't be adequate. For example, maybe there isn't a good type of interface if you mod things in. Maybe the game is made in a way where it's hard to see the information at the right time, even if you mod in a place where you can see it. You could keep the wiki open the entire time you're playing, but that does have a sort of immersion breaking, flow breaking aspect to it. There's a reason that many games want you to not leave the game, while you're having your immersive experience. I think that is a tried and true psychological way to help the player have more fun. It's fun to not have to get out of the game. Is this section literally just me reassuring Mr. Foot that it's okay to be annoyed about this and talking through how there really is no solution? It is so far, but there's a gigantic block of text in my notes that I haven't talked about yet. So let's read what it is and see if it solves the conundrum. I bet it won't. Even if builds feel okay to use in practice, part of the fun is thinking about the options, talked about that, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I mean, and again, like, without a very thorough and, well, also streamlined and well formatted and accessible wiki, just having a wiki doesn't make it that easy to use the information. For example, I think Path of Exile has a complicated relationship to this whole discussion in general, but the wiki is, it was a lot for me as a newer player. Like, I'm not saying it's good or bad necessarily, but it's a lot. The game's information, the density of information you could have that the game doesn't tell you, but that you could have, that you could mod in or that you could look up, may foil attempts to simply know that information. If there's just too much, if it were information, and wow, I wonder why they did that. Maybe it's because they don't tell you the numbers, but if they did, it would be way too much. It would be information overload. Then simply going and finding that information may not solve the problem. It may be just impossible to make that game that way have a fulfilling build-making experience. So, I don't know. But again, I think at the end of the day, it's about having fun. And so another thing you can go back to is just feel vindicated that merely me telling you, I really don't think there's a good reason, I really don't think there's anything you can do in some cases, may help. You can have a different kind of fun, sure. I still had fun making builds in Lies of P. I just was able to enjoy different options without worrying too much about, this one works this way versus that way. There's an element where you can kind of not pull back the curtain, or it's so tedious to pull back the curtain that you could just deal with it. I made a couple of different weapons in Lies of P that were good in certain niche situations, so I thought. And it would be painstaking enough to test whether they actually were beneficial in niche different situations that I didn't, because it would be annoying to do. If it were easy to do, I would want to know, and so I would know. But if it's annoying enough to find out if different options are actually better than each other, to some extent, the illusion can work, and you can have the fun of choosing this option against that option, and having some benefits come of it, and then you just don't know if it was like really badly balanced with everything else. That can be okay. It's not the same as having fun, where you get to calibrate the build specifically by knowing what everything does, but I do think that is its own kind of fun. And ignorance, as they say, is bliss. If that is what you're forced to have, it's not like impossible to have fun if the game forces you not to know or makes it very annoying to find out if these options are actually good against each other. Now, it did start to bother me. Toward the end of my time playing through a New Game Plus in Lies of P, I stopped rotating through as many of my weapons. I began to feel like there wasn't really a good reason to approach combat that many different ways. And a lot of the time I would choose a specific weapon, I was actually making myself a little weaker against that enemy. And in fact, the diversity was beginning to feel false. I was beginning to detect, through my experience using those different options, that maybe the game actually wasn't all that well balanced around those things. And I found out fairly early on, if you play Lies of P, this is something you may or may not notice, but the stats kind of fall off. Like, if you get to a certain medium amount of a stat, you start to get way less benefit from it, which is a little weird because they want you to spec heavily into the stat that fits the type of weapon you want to use. But then if you do that too much, it starts to give you almost no benefit, so you might as well spread them out. But there's really no clear indication of this. You just kind of have to notice, and maybe they've even changed it. It's possible they patched this and it went away or something. Why? How? What? I don't know why they would do such a thing. I could speculate. Let's not. But I guess my concern is that it ultimately means you have to not play for too long, right? You can try to suspend your disbelief and just vibe check it out, but even then you'll probably notice after a while. So it's not a great solution either. I think the ultimate problem, as I teased a little bit earlier in the parlay, from my perspective, is playtesting. Is that a lot of players don't or aren't asked to accurately communicate what their experience of working through the game's information was like. They don't give enough feedback about what they were wondering at a given part of the game, or what kind of builds they would like to make, or whatever. Or maybe it's even a further problem where those people are seen as like not a standard player or like the common playtester, when again really it should be that the people playtesting the game are people who want the thing the game is trying to be good at, not just the average human being, which doesn't really exist anyway, right? And there just isn't an easy way to do that. But the problem then is that developers don't really get a way to test parts of games except against the general population, things that basically everybody would like, which makes it very difficult for games to become specific, to be about things that only some people would currently enjoy. And that in turn makes it hard for those things to become broad. I don't think that enjoying making builds is actually a very niche appeal. It just seems that way now. But an industry full of games that made it like not insufferable to do really good build systems, and games catered to those things, we might have a world full of people who enjoyed doing that kind of thing. I don't think it's actually that niche, except for the fact that you need to take a good amount of time to do it, and you wouldn't have to take so much time out of your day to do it if the games weren't so obtuse about what exactly it is you're manipulating, if the information was in the games. So it kind of wraps on itself. Because the information is there, the information won't be there. And until we can somehow break that cycle, until some idiot just decides to try to get people to think about this more, despite there being no clear incentive to do so, I don't see how we're going to get out of it, which is why I do what I'm doing for a living. So I hope that you can at least accept that, me, as an apology. Take me out to dinner first, because I don't have a better answer than that. I don't think there's a great solution. I think many games, the decision the game is offering the player doesn't have any significance unless they were to understand what the decision is about, but the game simply doesn't equip you to know that thing. Just by the way, this isn't only something that is a problem for making build decisions. I recently played a little bit of Pathologic 2, which was pretty interesting. I started playing this game as an aside, and it is an aside, this doesn't have to do with the parlay, but there's a related thing. Because Pathologic 2 is a game that struck me as something trying to be good in a way other than fun, basically. It seemed to want to make me feel unpleasant on purpose, but in an intentional way, not why it is in most games and media, I think, which is usually it's just a mistake. It's not really being done intentionally. The thing is just bad, but it might accidentally be doing something kind of interesting because it's bad. This is a game that you might not like, but I do think is fully owning the unpleasant feeling it gives you. It is doing it on purpose. And I know that because when you go into the options menu, you can adjust the difficulty, and you can adjust the parameters of the difficulty. How quickly you get hungry or sick or thirsty or tired. And when you scroll over those slider bars, the game tells you why those things are in the game. Because of course it does. You can't use the ability to adjust the difficulty that way unless they tell you why that thing is in the game. Obviously, you need to do game design to adjust the difficulty in a way that will actually be a coherent game. And you can't do that unless you know what the design purpose of those things is in the game. So I might not like Pathologic 2, I don't know, I'm not being facetious. but I know that the people who made it have a reason why they made it that way. They don't know. No one can know whether people will actually enjoy having those experiences. But I know that there is a reason it's that way, at the very least, because they told me. I can engage with it in an intellectual way, at least, and try to enjoy what I can of the experience because they told me what is happening. They told me why I get hungry. I mean, it's obvious, but why you get tired. You know, it's not rocket science, but simply giving the players the information means they can engage with the subject in a way beyond merely impulsively liking it or disliking it. Many players come to understand a game's systems and simply find them, I would word it as like just so beautiful or satisfying that they keep playing the game almost in spite of disliking its gameplay. Sometimes this can be bad. Sometimes people play a game just because they understand it well and they want to feel like they understand something. But I think a lot of the time, it is so satisfying to understand how a system works that it can be cathartic to merely play a game that is understandable. Simply putting the information about what is happening in a game in the game makes the game good in a new way, separate from the game's previous design goals. So I would argue there really isn't a great reason to not include the numbers or parameters of your build choices in basically any game. It just might make sense in some games to not default to showing that information, but I find it very difficult to imagine a game where it would make the game worse to even be able to know that information. And if it would make the game better to know that information, to be able to know that information, I don't really see how putting it in the game would make it worse. Again, the only caveat is maybe you have some option to toggle it off or default to it off and you can toggle it on. But beyond that, I don't see it. I don't know all reasons, but we sure covered a whole lot of them, and there are a lot of benefits to doing it the way we're suggesting. So what do you got over there, game industry? There's gotta be something pretty good why you're not including this stuff in games. Just put it in. Put it in and see what happens. See what bad thing happens. I don't know. You're not gonna gamble with your livelihood if you died on the hill of making your game. So I have some sympathy for people being nervous about including these things. Maybe people won't get it and they'll just bounce off it. But what I always like to say is that thinking that you have particular tastes is often a mistake. If you really like something and you can explain why, you're not that special. Other people will like it. Go forth and share it with people. People will think it's cool to be able to know the reasons why things do certain amounts of damage in your game. That is interesting and significant to people. Again, I feel like the litmus test is just explain why you think that. If you have a reason, I don't know, man, it's like other people will probably like it too. Just give it a shot. Let people decide. So I'm with you, Mr. Food. I'm not sure what else I can do. I had a lot of fun with this one. Thank you for asking. It's kind of I hate this thing in game design at the moment, but it's very fulfilling to talk about for a while. So I talked about it for a while. Probably the longest parlay where I don't do what the parlay prompt asked, but I hope you'll forgive me. Yeah, I don't know. If you want more parlay like this, you can get them in the description. You know, I tried to give you a proper answer. Yeah, I'll see you next time. You know, this was, I fulfilled the request, right?